Hi, scholars. Happy Wednesday. I'm excited to be with you today. Today, we're going to be reading this book called Jane Goodall. Before we begin reading this book, to get our heart and brain ready, we're going to talk about three things before we look at the front cover. First, I'm going to ask you a question, then I'm going to share with you an important word, and then we're going to talk about the genre of this book. So, my question is, what is something that you are curious about that you want to learn more about? And if you have a chance, turn to someone sitting next to you to share your idea. Great. So for me, I really love plants, and I'm really interested to know more about what each plant needs in order to grow and to survive. And particularly, I'm really interested in this plant, my favorite one right here. So thinking about your answer to this question is going to better help you understand the story. The second thing we're going to talk about is an important word. This word is researcher. Say it with me. Researcher. Let's clap out the syllables in this word. Researcher. Let's pump it up. Researcher. Let's chop it down. Researcher. Let's Iron Man it. Researcher. Let's end by counting on our fingers. Researcher. There are three syllables in this word researcher. Researcher means someone who collects information on a topic. So for this story, Jane Goodall is a researcher. The last thing we're going to talk about before we look at the front cover is the genre of this book. The genre of this book, or the type of book this is nonfiction, which means that it's new and true. It's a new and true book, which means we're learning new and true facts from this book. And more precisely, the type of book this is a biography. A biography is when we're learning about a person and their life. So for this book, we're going to be learning about Jane Goodall and Jane Goodall's life. So now that our heart and brain's ready, let's look at our front cover of this book. That's going to help us learn more about Jane Goodall's identities. So from research, I know that Jane Goodall's gender identity is a woman. I know Jane Goodall's age identity in this book starts off as a child and then she becomes an adult. I know that her race identity is white, and her interest, just like how the illustrator is showing us, is one of her interests is about chimpanzees. So let's begin reading. Jane Goodall, written by Maria Isabel Sanchez Vergara, illustrated by Beatrice Hirochi. Jane Goodall. When Jane was a little girl, her father gave her a stuffed chimpanzee named Jubilee. She carried him everywhere she went. I'm wondering if this chimpanzee was important to Jane because she didn't let him go anywhere. And also the illustrator is showing us more about Jane's family identity. There's her sibling, her parents, and her dog. Jane loved animals very much. She wanted to live in the jungle with wild chimpanzees, just like the heroes of her bedtime stories, the characters Tarzan and Jane. And at night, her mother read her their adventures. I'm wondering if the illustrator is trying to show us what it possibly could look like if Jane lived out her dream of living with the chimpanzees in the jungle. But Jane could not afford to go to college to study animals, so she would have to study them in her own way. It sounds like the author is telling us more about Jane's class identity and telling us that she had less access to money and experiences like going to college. So Jane saved every penny she had until she could buy a boat ticket to Kenya in Africa. When she arrived, Jane met a well-known scientist named Louis Leakey. He was looking for a chimpanzee researcher willing to study them in the wild. We know that a researcher is someone who collects information about things. So in this case, it sounds like the author is telling us Louis Leakey was looking for someone to collect information about chimpanzees. He thought that they could learn about humans by studying apes. It was an opportunity Jane had been waiting for. It sounds like the author is telling us that she found a way to learn and to study chimpanzees. And it looks like the illustrator is showing us that Jane and Louis Leakey are about to shake hands. Sometimes you do that when you're making an agreement with someone. In this case, it sounds like Jane made an agreement to accept a job to be a researcher. So Jane took another journey to the shores of Gombe in Tanzania. To start with, she couldn't see any of the chimpanzees, but you had the feeling that they were near or close to her, watching her. So illustrating is Jane here with a tool, the binoculars. And then I noticed that there's a group of chimpanzees nearby, but Jane can't see them yet. So she decided to sit quietly in the same spot day after day. Sounds like Jane found another way to observe the chimpanzees and wondering if this is going to work. Finally, a small group of chimpanzees appeared and let her sit with them. Jane had finally been accepted into the family. It sounds like the author is telling us that maybe the chimpanzees are more comfortable with Jane in their habitat or their home. That's why they allowed her to get near to them and for her to observe them. Instead of numbering the chimpanzees that she observed, all the other scientists and researchers did, Jane decided to give every chimpanzee a name. There was David Greybeard, Flo, Flint, Fifi, and Gigi, to name a few. It sounds like the author is telling us that Jane is showing us another way to be a researcher. In this case, it was giving animals or the chimpanzees that she's observing names instead of numbering them, like the other scientists and researchers did. By watching the chimpanzees carefully, Jane noticed some things. She noticed that some chimpanzees were kind, quiet, and generous, while other chimpanzees were not that kind, selfish, and sometimes described as bullies. It seemed that humans and chimpanzees were not so different after all. Sounds like she was now comparing what she observed what chimpanzees were doing and how they were behaving with humans. And then realized that humans and chimpanzees have things in common. Then Jane made another incredible discovery. Chimpanzees could make their own tools. This was something only humans were thought to do. Wow, it sounds like the author is telling us that as Jane was observing and watching the chimpanzees, that she learned that they can make tools just like humans can. And before this observation, it was believed that only humans could make tools. And I learned from research that chimpanzees use these sticks, they peel off all the leaves, and they poke holes into hills, in this case like termite hills, to collect all the termites from the hill so they could eat it. That's how they use this tool that they created. Jane's talent was quickly recognized or noticed by Cambridge University. Here she studied for a doctorate in animal behavior. And it wasn't long before she wrote her first article for one of the most famous science magazines. It sounds like Jane was becoming famous because she was sharing all of her new and true facts that she learned from observing chimpanzees in the wild. Jane continued to study chimpanzees in Gombe for over 40 years. That's a really long time. But jungles were starting to disappear across Africa, which put all animals in danger. And she knew she had to do something. So it sounds like Jane learned something else about chimpanzees and all animals that lived in the jungle, that they were in danger because the jungles were starting to disappear. And it looks like the illustrator is trying to show us maybe one reason why the jungle is starting to disappear. I noticed that the trees were being cut down here. But as the author said, Jane knew she had to do something. So it sounds like she noticed that there's a problem and she was making a commitment to try to help to solve it. Jane joined countless projects to protect nature. Sounds like she collaborated with lots of other people who also noticed this problem and wanted to try to solve it to protect nature. She was no longer just a courageous researcher, but also the most determined, she wouldn't give up, wildlife defender the world had ever seen. And noticing the illustrator showing, there's a lot of people in what it looks like to be maybe an auditorium, or they're in the audience. And I see a microphone here. It looks like maybe possibly she's giving a speech. Maybe that was one way that she was trying to protect nature, by saying it, by saying what the problem is. And the little girl who loved animals challenges us to be kind to nature. Because if chimpanzees can live in harmony with their environment, we can too. It sounds like the author is trying to leave us with a lesson that what Jane learned, that chimpanzees can live in harmony with nature, that us as humans can also do the same. And at the end of the book, there's a timeline for us to learn more new and true facts about Jane Goodall. A timeline is just sharing different points or different times in her life and giving more details about that. So here we see more details about when she was a child all the way to she's grown up. The end. Your career question is, what did Jane Goodall learn from the chimpanzees? Remember that good readers share the idea, but also support their idea with evidence from the book. So it could sound like Jane Goodall learned that because the author told me, or because the illustrator showing me. So if you have a chance, share your idea with someone that's sitting next to you. Great. For me, my answer to this question is, one thing that Jane Goodall learned from chimpanzees is that they were able to create their own tools to solve their problems. And I know this because the author told me chimpanzees could make their own tools. And the illustrator showed me here an example of the tools that they use to get more food. So good readers read their book and then retell or summarize what they learned from that book back to themselves or to other people. So we're going to do that together. I have an idea web for us to get all of our ideas from our heart and brain down on paper. In the middle of our idea web is the topic of the book that we just read. And in this case, it's Jane Goodall. So I wrote that here for us. On the outside of this idea web, we are writing the details that support our topic. So in this case, it's all of the new and true facts about Jane Goodall. So let's stop and think for a second about some new and true facts that we just read and learned about Jane Goodall. Oh, I remember in the book that I remember reading how Jane Goodall was observing chimps as they were making their own tools. So now I'm going to write that new and true fact here. The sentence I'm going to write is, she observed chimps making tools. So that first word is a basketball word, so I'm going to dribble that out. S-H-E, she observed. It's not a basketball word, so I'm going to do my best to stretch out this word. Observed. She observed chimps. It's not a basketball word, so I'm also stretching that word out. C-H, chimps. She observed chimps making. Oh, I know that make is a basketball word, M-A-K-E. And then I know that ing is I-N-G. So I'm going to put those together. M-A-K-ing. She observed chimps making tools. It's not a basketball, so I'm going to stretch this word out. Tools. And I ended with the period because I'm saying it with the green voice. She observed chimps making tools. So now, scholars, it's your turn. You are going to write down all of the new and true facts that you learned about Jane Goodall. We can't wait to read what you learned. Have a great day, scholars.